Hey, thank you all so much for being here. We will be doing no asanas other than sitting in hopefully Sukhasana, easy pose. And thank you so much to Wanderlust for having me. I do want to talk today about a little bit about my new book, The Road Home, but really what I want to talk about is this thing called the mindfulness movement. I don't know if that's a phrase that you've heard. On the cover of Time magazine, last year it was called the Mindful Revolution, which mindfulness has been part of my life, my whole life, not necessarily practicing it, but growing up in New York City, I was the Buddhist kid. Both of my parents since the early 1970s studied Buddhism, meditation, the nature of mind with a man named Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, founder of the Shambhala lineage, who you may have heard of, may not have. And so this is something I grew up with, and I've been a teacher of meditation and Buddhist philosophy for the last 13 years, and I've really noticed a shift, which you may have noticed. Wanderlust, I think, is an emerging phenomenon that's kind of part of this shift. When I was a kid in the 1980s and 1990s, there wasn't that much interest in meditation or Buddhism outside of the niche area where it was popular. And now, as a teacher, when I go anywhere, pretty much, when I tell somebody what I do, that I teach meditation and Buddhism, it never seems weird to the person I say it to. It's always like, that is so cool. That is amazing that you do that. Now, granted, I was in Portland, Oregon, last month on this book tour, and I realized, well, most of the places I teach are the places where, and this is the way I thought of it, where kale salads are popular. So I recognize that, but in the places where kale salads are popular, and I imagine that the Wanderlust Festival is one of those places, and if you don't like kale, I'm sorry. In the places where this is popular, there's a real sense of it's meditation and mindfulness are great things. Now, one of the interesting things is whenever I tell somebody what I do, they will often have this really weird response, which is say, that's so great, I wish I could meditate, but I just can't. I tried it. So we've at least reached the level of popularity with mindfulness meditation, and I joke in the book, The Road Home, where meditation has become the thing that we're all really happy that other people do. Whether or not we do it is a different story, but I like to sometimes put this sort of exploding popularity of at least the theme of mindfulness, which I think is about 10 years behind the exploding popularity of yoga, which I'm also a practitioner of. I like to look back at a memory that I could have never had because it happened 5 years before I was born. My mother, Janice, who's from a small town in Arkansas, in 1973, telling her parents, my grandparents, that she's a meditator now and that she's following this brilliant and wild Tibetan man discovering teachings on the nature of mind. So we've really come a long way, and I have conversations every day with therapists who are incorporating meditation. The high school that I went to in New York City, it's a progressive private high school, now has a course for seniors and juniors called The Art and Science of Mindfulness. And I got to speak to these young folks earlier this spring, and they're talking to me about mindfulness practice, loving kindness, meditation, the neuroscience, the default and active settings of the brain, and how mindfulness works with that. One of their 4 class meetings a week is a 30-minute yoga asana session followed by a 20-minute meditation, and that's their class. And I was thinking to myself, I wish I went to that high school. My college, Brown University, when I was a student there in the late 1990s, I think that I'm not misremembering it. The Brown Zen group, which was the one active meditation group, held its sits at 7 a.m. on Sunday morning. So you can imagine how popular that was. Now, as of 2014, 2015, you can major at Brown University in contemplative studies. Right? So it's a really interesting moment that we're in. I don't know if you consider yourself an active mindfulness practice. practitioner. I don't know if you consider yourself sort of, I'm happy other people do it. I just needed a break from the 3 yoga classes I was taking today. But we're really in this interesting moment, and on the cover of Time magazine last year, this is actually the second time that Time magazine has put a woman meditating on the cover. The first time was actually in 2003, and the woman meditating was actress Heather Graham. So this was the cover in 2014 of Time magazine. And from the Buddhist community, from the sort of depth practicing yoga community, there's been a little bit of what you could call a purist critique, which I think is really important, or backlash, you could say, against the broad spreading of mindfulness into all of these arenas of secular life. Sort of this theme that maybe mindfulness is being stripped of its more ethical and transformative context that the Buddhist teachings have. And that term, I don't know if you've heard this term, has been referred to as McMindfulness. The danger of McMindfulness, as in McDonald's, as in mass-produced mindfulness. I haven't ever heard the term McYoga, but it could be just as easily applied. So actually, this cover of Time magazine, some of my friends in the Buddhist community and the yoga community who are serious practitioners, one, because this is the second time that Time magazine put a meditator on the cover, and both were young blonde women. That was one theme. But second, one of my friends says, that doesn't look like a person meditating. That looks like a person sunbathing. So this is, and then there's questions being asked about, like, if we train soldiers in mindfulness, is that just aiding further support for war, the military-industrial complex? If Google has a massive search inside yourself program, which they do, and friends of mine teach at, is that just training people how to be more focused in greed, right? So these are the kind of conversations that are going on. I think it's a beautiful conversation. The way I think about this is, it's okay if you start with a superficial approach to a psychological or spiritual tradition. I mean, I think everybody in this room who has an asana practice probably just started with thinking about, I want to settle my body down, maybe I want to look better, and maybe slowly that transforms your exploration. So with mindfulness, it's the same thing. Everything has a surface, right? That's the thing about when people call something superficial. It's like, did you expect there not to be a surface here? This is what sells magazines. So if you pick up this magazine, that's the people at Time have been trained in what actually gets people to pick up a magazine. So everything has a surface. It's only a problem if there's nothing underneath the surface. And this, as a Buddhist teacher, I'm really interested in the idea that mindfulness comes from a much deeper and more integrated well of psychological, philosophical, and spiritual teachings. So that's really, what I wanted to talk about is the ability to go deeper, to take one's practice deeper. And I think you might just be at the point, if you're here, if you're watching this, where you're just trying to transition from being one of those people who's happy that other people meditate to being one of those people who actually meditate. I don't know, can I just see a show of hands how many people you're kind of in the I'm happy other people meditate camp? Awesome. So does that mean everyone else is in the I meditate regularly, like daily? No, yeah, right, okay. Yeah, right. So this gets to one of my favorite definitions of a Buddhist. There's many different definitions of a Buddhist, but my favorite one is somebody who either meditates regularly or feels guilty because they haven't meditated recently. Right? But so there is a whole context of having a community to practice with, having a regular practice, looking into what does it mean to have a mind? How do we actually, in the words of the founder of my tradition, make friends with the person who's having all of these human experiences, right? And I think that's part of where mindfulness needs to go deeper, and this is one of the points I really tried to bring out in the road home, is lots of people say, well, yoga is my mindfulness practice, and that's great. Some people say running is my mindfulness practice, or painting is my mindfulness practice. But to go deeper, the reason meditation and actually studying a tradition is so important is it's really important, from my way of looking at things, not to just practice mindfulness in action, but to actually take some time to get to know the mind that's having all of these experiences, which is not something most of us, unless you're going to the high school I went now, we're trained in our educational environment. 98% of the things that we're educated in is we get to know the world out there. We get to know the objects in the world and how they fit together. So this is why meditation is so hard, is because we're taking a person who's mostly learned how to relate to the world out there and saying, who's having this experience? Can you spend 10 or 15 minutes a day with the person having all of these experiences in the world? And I've talked to, even it's possible you could even be a PhD. This is changing rapidly in Western psychology. And you're horrified by the prospect of spending 15 minutes with your own mind, because what that person has possibly trained in is learning about other people's minds, right? So there's establishing a practice is the first way to really go deeper. And then I would say that there's other ways that we can really take our practice deeper. The first is to really look into not just what practice you're doing, but to actually study the history and lineages of these practices. They actually come from someplace, Yoga comes from someplace, right? There's 8 limbs of yoga. There's 8 parts of the Buddhist path. Similarly, it's the same conversation you could have with the 8 limbs of yoga. Asana is part of that. It's not the whole. Same thing with the Buddhist, or as I like to call it, the Awakeist tradition, because that's a full translation. Mindfulness is one of the 8 limbs, right? It's sort of the exact same conversation. So I think there is a paralleling for those of us who are yoga practitioners between asana and mindfulness, and then saying, how could I go deeper into seeing the context and the lineages that brought these teachings into being. And that's something I've really, because I think I'm a modern person. I'm not a cool person, but I'm not into Asian music. I wear wrist malas only if I'm actually using it to count mantras, although this is a beautiful Wanderlust wrist mala that I got. I like Radiohead, I quote Radiohead, right? So it's not about embracing the past, it's just about learning the context of humans and where these practices came from and what they were working with, and what is universal about these practices, and also what is different about our current situation. The second way I would say it's really important to go deeper is to actually become a student of the ethics involved in these practices, which doesn't mean you have to make certain choices, I'm not a celibate monk practitioner. That's not the only way to be a full Buddhist practitioner, just like it's not the only way to be a yogi, right? But I should at least look at what would be the ethics of, for example, studying responsible sexuality. What would be the ethics of ahimsa in this world, if I really want to take my practice deeper? What are the ethics that come from looking not just into my own mind, but looking into the truth of interdependence, which is a big part of the Buddhist teachings when you actually go deeper beyond just deeper than just mindfulness, right? So I think that's an interesting thing, because in studying ethics, we also really have to empower ourselves to say, well, what are the issues I'm facing? For example, in the Buddhist tradition, 2,500 years ago, one of the things they told you to refrain from was alcohol, probably because this was one of the main intoxicants. My main intoxicant is my smartphone. My iPhone 6 Plus is what I'm working with, right? So it's not necessarily about not drinking or drinking, it's about what does it mean to actually work with an ethical practice, see what the intention behind that was, and how can it be applied. So I think ethics are really important. The third thing I would say, and I think this is especially true with Buddhism, but I think it's just as true as with being an asana practitioner, look at our practice beyond just the personal level, which I think is tricky because a lot of times we are coming to a practice because we're just trying to reduce stress, feel better, connect with ourselves. It's interesting that even if you've heard of the educational 8-week training that John Kabat-Zinn talked about, mindfulness-based stress reduction, stress was just actually his thought process of how he could translate the Buddhist concept of dukkha and suffering, right? So there's something really powerful to saying, you know what, I'm going to stop looking at other people for a little while and I am going to work on my own practice. I think we all need to take time each day to be on the personal level of our experience, working with my own body, my own mind, my own experience. As I say in the book, coming home to ourselves. So the personal level of practice is there. But in the Interdependence Project, as well as in the Shambhala lineage, we work with this framework where there's actually 3 levels of practice. One is the personal. The second is the interpersonal. And the interpersonal is the area of relationship, the area of relationship with people we love, the area of relationship with people we're having a hard time with, the area of relationship with people we're neutral towards or don't even know about. Right? So actually making that part of our practice. And this is off the mat, right? This is off the cushion, but this is part of going deeper with our practice, is actually how does my yoga practice, how does my meditation practice affect my relationships, and how can I extend the practice into that realm? And then the third level is the collective level of our experience, the shared level. The level of our experience where, for example, people who do these practices about developing more mindfulness and compassion should not sit idly by with what happened in South Carolina, or with our destruction of the planet, or with how communities, yoga communities, meditation communities, are often not friendly spaces. You know, how could we actually work with participating and engaging and applying these teachings to our social and cultural experience? So the thing that I love about these 3 levels is I think every practitioner of anything in history has been really good at one of those. You know, there's kind of, you could think of as archetypes, like somebody who's going on a retreat for 3 years is really nailing the personal level of practice, right? They go into a cave or they go secluded away somewhere, and they work on their meditation practice, they work on their yoga practice, but they're really focusing on, let me awaken myself. I have a lot of friends in my life who are new-ish mothers, the mothers of small children, and it's almost like when you're a mother and you're a practitioner of a little person, I thought about it, it's almost like you're doing a retreat, like a totally immersed retreat on that second level, on the interpersonal level. And it's hard to keep your own personal practice going, and it's definitely hard it's like, what happened in South Carolina? What was that? It's really sometimes hard to be part of a larger situation. And then the activist or some artists that I know are really thinking about how do I transform culture, right? But to bring all 3 of them together in a balanced practice, that's really what I consider 21st century awakening. Every day of our lives, we might focus more on one of those levels, but the question for me is not so much personal awakening, it's a question of balance between those 3 levels, the personal, interpersonal, and the collective. And that's really how I feel like we really come home to who we are and come home to our participation in the world that we actually inhabit. So I don't take this view that awakening or enlightenment is disappearing into the ether, leaving the world behind. I take the view that it's a completely balanced approach to being a compassionate and mindful person in this world. So I think it's wonderful that people are getting interested in meditation. And if I just spent the rest of my life getting those people who are happy other people meditate to the point where they feel confident to have a practice, that would be great. But in closing this section of the talk, I'd just like to say, if you can find a way to go deeper, if you're at that point where you're like, I have a practice, but I don't yet have a complete path, I hope this has been a helpful way to initiate that discussion. So thank you so much. I think we're going to transition to Q&A.
I got involved in social justice issues back in the 80s in New York City. I was very involved in issues related to HIV/AIDS awareness and advocacy, and I was a frontline activist, which meant I was the person they put in the front of the line with a megaphone because I was aggressive, and I was intense, and I was not afraid of confrontation.